They laughed at the Mafia boss's secretary because she looked ordinary. But before the night was over, the most powerful man in Chicago would cross a ballroom full of diamonds just to take her hand. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the Grand Astoria ballroom, her fingers tightening around a silver clipboard as crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the marble floor. The room looked like something from an old Hollywood film. Women in designer gowns, men in tailored tuxedos, waiters carrying champagne beneath ceilings painted with clouds and gold leaf. And then there was Clara, wearing a simple black dress she had owned for 3 years, her shoulder-length brown hair curled neatly, her makeup understated, almost invisible beside the glittering crowd. She wasn't supposed to be invisible tonight. She was Adrian Moretti's executive secretary, the woman who managed his schedule, negotiated with attorneys, and kept his business empire from collapsing under its own weight. But to the guests filling the ballroom, she was just the plain secretary standing too close to the spotlight. "Look who actually came inside," a woman's voice said with a soft laugh. Clara turned and saw Vanessa Sinclair surrounded by a cluster of socialites near the champagne tower. Vanessa's emerald gown shimmered under the lights, and the diamond bracelet on her wrist probably cost more than Clara's annual salary. "I thought staff members usually stayed behind the curtains," Vanessa continued, loud enough for the people around her to hear. A few guests chuckled. Another woman tilted her head and added, "Maybe she got lost on the way to the service entrance." The laughter spread in small waves, polite enough to sound sophisticated, cruel enough to make Clara feel every pair of eyes turning toward her. She kept her posture straight. For years working for Adrian Moretti had taught her many things, and one of them was that dignity was often measured by what you refused to react to. "I'm here to deliver updated seating arrangements," she said calmly. Vanessa stepped closer, her smile sharpening. "Of course you are. You're always working, aren't you? Tell me, Clara, does Mr. Moretti even notice what you look like? Or are you just part of the office furniture?" Someone behind Vanessa laughed harder than the others. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Excuse me." She moved to step around them. Vanessa shifted slightly, blocking her path for just a moment. "You know, with a different dress and maybe a little confidence, you might almost pass for a guest." The women around her burst into another round of laughter. Clara lowered her eyes briefly, not in surrender, but to keep the hurt from showing. She had spent years building a life out of discipline and hard work, years helping support her mother after a heart surgery that insurance barely covered, years proving that reliability mattered more than appearances. None of that seemed to matter in this ballroom. To these people, she was still the woman in the plain black dress who didn't belong among the silk and diamonds. She turned away without another word and walked toward the tall doors leading to the terrace, each step measured and quiet. Behind her, the laughter faded into the music of the string quartet, but one sentence followed her across the marble floor like a shadow. "Some people should remember where they belong." Clara reached the edge of the ballroom and drew a slow breath, believing she had escaped the humiliation unnoticed. She didn't know that from the top of the grand staircase. Adrian Moretti had heard every word. Clara stepped onto the terrace and let the cool October air brush against her face, but it did little to calm the tightness in her chest. Below, the Chicago River reflected the city lights in long ribbons of gold and silver, and the distant sound of traffic hummed like a world far removed from crystal chandeliers and whispered insults. She set the clipboard on a small iron table and pressed her hands against the railing, forcing herself to breathe slowly. "You are here to work," she whispered. "Nothing more." The words had become a habit over the years, a quiet reminder that she could not afford to be distracted by what people thought of her. For years earlier, Clara had walked into Moretti Holdings wearing a thrift store blazer and carrying a resume that listed 2 community college degrees, 3 part-time jobs, and a 6-month gap she always dreaded explaining. Her father had died unexpectedly, leaving behind medical bills and a mortgage that threatened to swallow everything her family owned. While her friends were starting careers and planning vacations, Clara had been driving 40 minutes each way to a bookkeeping job during the day and waiting tables at a diner at night. When the opportunity to interview for an executive assistant position appeared, she had almost skipped it, convinced someone with her background would never be considered. Instead, she had met Adrian Moretti. He had been 31 then, already one of the most influential businessmen in the city, with the kind of presence that made boardrooms fall silent the moment he entered. 6'3", broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the faint edge of tattoo ink visible beneath the cuff of his white shirt. He had looked intimidating enough to send most applicants scrambling for the door. But during the interview, he had asked her a question no one else had bothered with. "What is the hardest thing you have ever had to manage?" Clara had answered honestly. "Keeping my family afloat after my father died." Adrian had studied her for a long moment and replied, "That is not a resume answer." "It is the truth," she had said, expecting the interview to end there. It had not. She got the job 3 days later. Since then, Clara had become the person who remembered every meeting, every deadline, every detail that others overlooked. She knew which clients preferred phone calls over emails, which attorneys needed reminders, and which charity contracts required a second review before Adrian signed them. She had sat through 16-hour negotiation days, reorganized international travel plans during snowstorms, and once caught a financial reporting error that could have cost the company millions of dollars. Adrian had thanked her with a brief nod and the words, "Good catch, Miss Whitmore." It was the highest praise he ever gave anyone. Yet outside the office, none of those accomplishments seemed to exist. To people like Vanessa Sinclair, Clara was simply the plain woman who carried folders behind a powerful man. The terrace door opened behind her. Clara straightened quickly, expecting another guest, but it was only Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the Moretti estate's longtime house manager. The older woman approached with gentle concern in her eyes. "I was looking for you," she said softly. "The revised seating chart is needed in the ballroom." Clara picked up the clipboard immediately. "I am sorry. I just needed a minute." Mrs. Brooks hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Do not let those women make you feel small. I have worked for the Moretti family for 28 years, and I have seen many beautiful gowns hide very ugly hearts." Clara managed a faint smile. "Thank you. Besides," Mrs. Brooks added, glancing toward the ballroom doors, "Mr. Moretti notices far more than people think he does." Before Clara could respond, the orchestra inside shifted to a slower melody, and a voice from the ballroom announced that the first waltz of the evening would begin in 10 minutes. Clara smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and followed Mrs. Brooks back toward the doors, unaware that Adrian Moretti was no longer standing at the top of the staircase. He was already walking through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the terrace where Clara had been standing alone. Clara re-entered the ballroom beside Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the revised seating chart held carefully against her chest. The orchestra was tuning for the first waltz, and the soft glow from hundreds of candles reflected across the polished marble floor like liquid gold. Guests were drifting toward the center of the room, eager for the traditional opening dance that always marked the most photographed moment of the evening. Clara kept to the edge of the crowd, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become second nature after years of working high-profile events. She had almost reached the event coordinator's table when a waiter hurried past her carrying a silver tray stacked with place cards. One card slipped free and fluttered to the floor. Clara bent automatically, catching it before anyone stepped on it. Her eyes scanned the name for less than a second, and her stomach tightened. The card read Senator Harold Bennett, Table 1. That was wrong. She knew it was wrong because she had personally finalized the seating chart that afternoon, placing the senator at Table 4 beside the hospital foundation board. Table 1 was reserved for Adrian Moretti, his senior executives, and the foreign investors currently negotiating a major redevelopment contract. If the senator were seated there, the press would interpret it as a political endorsement, exactly the kind of public misunderstanding Adrian had spent months avoiding. Clara looked toward the coordinator station. The young assistant managing the cards was already directing guests, completely unaware of the mistake. Without hesitation, Clara crossed the room and quietly exchanged the incorrect card for the proper one from the backup envelope she always carried for emergencies. It was a small action, almost invisible, but it prevented a problem that could have become tomorrow's headline. "Still fixing things behind the scenes?" a voice drawled from behind her. Clara turned and found Vanessa Sinclair watching her with amused contempt. Two women from earlier stood beside her, champagne glasses in hand. "I suppose someone has to," Clara replied politely. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound intimate while ensuring the nearby guests could still hear. "Tell me, Clara, do you ever get tired of acting like you belong in rooms like this?" Clara slid the corrected place card into position. "I am doing my job." "Exactly," Vanessa said with a laugh. "Your job, not this." She gestured toward the ballroom, the chandeliers, the couples gathering near the dance floor. "You are the woman who carries schedules and answers emails. The rest of us are here because we were invited." One of the women beside her smiled thinly. "Although I will admit, it is sweet that she dressed up for the occasion." Another added, "Adrian is very generous with his employees." The implication hung in the air, subtle but cruel. Clara felt several nearby guests glance in her direction, curiosity mixing with judgment. She could have explained that Adrian had invited every department head and executive staff member, that she was attending as part of the leadership team, not as a servant who had wandered into the ballroom. But experience had taught her that people who were determined to misunderstand you rarely changed their minds because of facts. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her tone even. Vanessa moved again, blocking her path with practiced elegance. "Oh, do not leave yet. The first waltz is about to begin, and the master of ceremonies just announced that it will be dedicated to the most important woman in Mr. Moretti's life. I would hate for you to miss watching someone else take the place you secretly wish you had." A few guests chuckled softly. Clara felt the words land harder than the earlier insults because they exposed the assumption beneath all of it, that a woman who worked beside a powerful man must either be invisible or be quietly hoping for more. The truth was far less glamorous. She admired Adrian. She trusted him. She was grateful for the opportunities he had given her. And she had spent 4 years carefully burying any feeling that threatened to become personal, because crossing that line would risk the one thing she could not afford to lose, the career that had rebuilt her family's life. The orchestra began the opening measures of the waltz. Conversations softened. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the grand staircase, waiting for Adrian Moretti to descend and choose his partner for the first dance. Vanessa's smile widened with certainty. Clara lowered her gaze and took a small step backward, already preparing to slip out of the spotlight before the moment became even more humiliating. What she did not see was Adrian standing at the foot of the staircase, his dark eyes moving past the women who were openly competing for his attention and settling on the one woman trying her hardest not to be noticed. The ballroom held its breath as Adrian Moretti stepped forward from the base of the grand staircase. The orchestra continued its elegant waltz, but the sound seemed to drift into the background beneath the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. He moved with the same controlled confidence that made seasoned executives nervous during negotiations, shoulders squared, expression unreadable, black tuxedo fitting his powerful frame with effortless precision. The faint edge of tattoo ink disappeared beneath the crisp white cuff at his wrist as he adjusted it once, a small gesture that somehow made the room feel even quieter. Every woman near the dance floor straightened expectantly. Vanessa Sinclair's smile turned radiant, and she lifted her champagne glass slightly as if she had already been chosen. The mayor's daughter angled herself toward the center of the room. A foreign investor's wife whispered something excitedly to her friend. Clara stood near the event coordinator's table, one step back from the crowd, the clipboard still in her hands. She could feel the humiliation from Vanessa's words lingering like heat against her skin, and she told herself that the smartest thing she could do was disappear before the first dance began. She lowered her gaze and took a careful step toward the side corridor that led to the staff offices. "Miss Whitmore." Adrian's voice cut through the ballroom, low and calm, but impossible to ignore. Clara stopped instantly. Her heart gave a sharp, painful beat as every nearby guest turned toward her. For a second she wondered if there was a problem with the seating arrangements, if he had discovered another issue that needed her attention. She turned slowly. Adrian was looking directly at her, not past her, not through her. "Would you come here for a moment?" he asked. The request was simple, almost conversational, yet it carried the kind of authority that made people move without thinking. Clara crossed the marble floor, aware of the silence spreading outward with each step. She stopped a respectful distance from him. "Is something wrong, sir?" she asked quietly. Adrian's eyes held hers for a brief moment before he glanced toward the front tables. "The senator's place card was corrected before anyone noticed," he said. "You caught the mistake." Clara blinked, surprised. "Yes, sir. I did not want it to create confusion." "It would have created far more than confusion," he replied. "You prevented a very public problem." Around them, guests exchanged puzzled looks. This was not the conversation they had expected before the ceremonial first dance. Vanessa's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Clara shook her head lightly. "It was a small thing." Adrian's gaze sharpened. "You have a habit of calling important things small." The words landed with unexpected warmth, and Clara felt her carefully controlled composure waver for the first time all evening. Before she could answer, the master of ceremonies stepped forward near the orchestra and raised his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the Moretti Foundation Gala. As tradition dictates, the first waltz of the evening is reserved for the woman who holds the highest place in Mr. Moretti's trust and esteem." A ripple of anticipation swept through the room. Vanessa lifted her chin, already preparing to step forward. Clara instinctively began to retreat. "I should go," she whispered. "You do not need me for this." She took one step back, but Adrian spoke again, more softly this time. "Clara." Hearing her first name in his voice felt strangely intimate, not improper, but personal in a way that caught her off guard. She looked up. The hard edge that usually defined his expression had eased into something thoughtful, almost protective. Then Adrian turned away from the center of the dance floor and looked directly at the orchestra leader. "Do not begin yet," he said. The musicians lowered their instruments mid-measure. The ballroom fell completely silent. Vanessa's confident smile finally disappeared. Clara stood motionless, her pulse fluttering in her throat, as Adrian took one slow step toward her, closing the distance between them while an entire ballroom watched. Adrian stopped directly in front of Clara, close enough that she could catch the faint scent of cedar and bergamot from his cologne. The ballroom remained utterly silent, the kind of silence that only existed when hundreds of people were afraid to miss a single word. Clara's fingers tightened around the clipboard until the edges pressed into her palms. "Sir," she said softly, "everyone is waiting." "I know," Adrian replied. His voice was calm, but there was something deliberate in the way he looked at her, as if he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. He glanced toward the guests gathered around the dance floor, then back to Clara. "Do you know what I have watched for the last 20 minutes? Clara shook her head. "I watched people laugh at the woman who has protected this company more times than they will ever know." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vanessa's expression hardened. Adrian continued before anyone could speak. "I watched them mistake quietness for weakness. I watched them assume that a simple black dress meant a lack of value." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Please do not do this," she whispered. "I do not want to cause a scene." His gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "You did not cause this scene, Clara." Hearing her name spoken so openly, with no title and no distance, made her chest tighten. For 4 years he had called her Miss Whitmore in meetings, in hallways, even when they were the only 2 people left in the office after midnight. The change was small, but it felt enormous. Adrian turned slightly toward the ballroom and spoke clearly enough for every guest to hear. "The first waltz is not a reward for the loudest person in the room. It is not reserved for the most expensive gown or the most recognizable family name." Vanessa stepped forward with a brittle smile. "Adrian, I think everyone understands the tradition." He looked at her, and the room seemed to cool by several degrees. "I do not believe they do." The smile disappeared from Vanessa's face. Adrian faced the guests again. "Tonight, the woman who deserves my trust is the one who arrived early, stayed unnoticed, corrected a mistake that could have damaged this foundation, and never asked for credit." While others were focused on being seen, she was focused on protecting the work all of us are here to support. Clara felt every eye in the ballroom shift toward her. The attention was overwhelming, but beneath the embarrassment was another feeling she had not expected: relief. For the first time that evening, someone was speaking about what she had done, not how she looked. Adrian lowered his voice slightly as he addressed her again. "You were trying to leave because you thought you did not belong here." Clara swallowed. "I am your secretary. This is your event." "You are my executive secretary," he corrected gently. "You sit in strategy meetings. You negotiate with attorneys. You manage operations that affect thousands of employees. Do not reduce yourself to a title people use when they want to feel superior." The words struck something deep inside her, something that had been worn down by years of being underestimated. Clara opened her mouth, but no response came. Adrian held her gaze for one long, steady moment, then looked down at the clipboard still clutched against her chest. "May I?" he asked. Confused, Clara handed it to him. He passed it to a nearby staff member without taking his eyes off her. Then, slowly and with complete certainty, Adrian extended his right hand toward her. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of a public declaration. Gasps spread through the ballroom. Vanessa stared as if she could not process what she was seeing. Clara looked at his hand, then up at him, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Adrian," she whispered, forgetting the formal title entirely. His expression did not change, but his eyes warmed with quiet conviction. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "I am asking you for the first dance." Clara stared at Adrian's outstretched hand as if it belonged to another world. The ballroom had disappeared into a blur of candlelight and crystal, and for a heartbeat she could hear nothing except the rush of blood in her ears. Every instinct told her to step back, to protect the careful professional distance she had maintained for 4 years. "Sir, I cannot," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian did not lower his hand. "You can," he said quietly. "And if you are worried about what this room thinks, look around." Clara's eyes lifted. The guests were watching with stunned disbelief. The women who had laughed at her earlier stood frozen beside the champagne tower. Vanessa Sinclair looked as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Even the orchestra members were waiting, instruments poised, afraid to begin until Adrian gave the signal. "They will talk," Clara said. "They already were," he replied. The truth of it hit her with unexpected force. He was right. The gossip, the judgment, the whispers about the plain secretary had already filled the ballroom long before he walked toward her. Refusing his hand would not erase any of it. It would only leave her standing alone in the center of the humiliation. Adrian took one small step closer, his voice dropping to a level meant only for her. "You have spent years standing beside me while I carried the weight of this company. Tonight I am asking you to stand beside me where everyone can see it." The words settled deep in her chest. Clara looked down at his hand one last time, then slowly placed her own in it. His fingers closed around hers with gentle certainty, warm and steady, and a collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Somewhere behind them, a champagne glass clinked against a tray. Vanessa took an involuntary step forward. "Adrian," she said sharply, "this is inappropriate." He did not even turn his head. "No," he said calmly. What was inappropriate was mocking someone who has earned more respect than most people in this room. The silence that followed was absolute. Adrian lifted Clara's hand slightly, not possessively, but with unmistakable pride, and guided her toward the center of the dance floor. Clara felt as though she were walking through a dream. The marble seemed too bright beneath her feet, the chandeliers too brilliant overhead. She was acutely aware of her simple black dress, of the absence of diamonds at her neck, of the fact that every camera in the ballroom was now pointed at her. "I do not know if I remember how to waltz," she admitted under her breath. A faint smile touched Adrian's mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all evening. "You learned at the company holiday party 3 years ago," he said. Clara blinked in surprise. She had forgotten that night entirely, a brief lesson from a dance instructor after most employees had gone home. Adrian had remembered. You remember that? I remember more than you think. The orchestra leader looked to Adrian for permission. Adrian gave a single nod. Music rose through the ballroom, soft strings filling the air with the opening notes of a classic waltz. Adrian placed one hand carefully at Clara's upper back, formal and respectful, while still holding her other hand in his. Relax, he murmured. You are not being examined. It feels that way. Then let them watch. He guided her into the first step. Clara moved automatically, years of discipline helping her follow the rhythm even as her heart threatened to race out of control. They turned slowly across the floor, candlelight catching in Adrian's dark hair and reflecting in his blue eyes. Around them, the crowd remained motionless. No one was whispering anymore. No one was laughing. The same people who had treated her like part of the furniture were now watching the most powerful man in the room hold her hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time since she had walked into the ballroom, Clara stopped trying to disappear. The waltz carried them across the ballroom in slow, elegant circles, and with every turn Clara felt the atmosphere changing around them. The shock that had frozen the guests was giving way to something else, something heavier. Shame. She could see it in the way people suddenly avoided her eyes, in the stiff smiles of those who had laughed earlier, in the nervous glances exchanged between socialites who realized the man leading her across the floor had heard everything. Adrian's hand remained steady against her back, guiding her effortlessly through the dance. You are doing fine, he murmured when she missed a step. Clara let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. I am trying not to trip in front of half the city. You are succeeding. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. Besides, if anyone should be uncomfortable right now, it is not you. Clara followed his gaze for a moment. Vanessa stood near the edge of the dance floor, her champagne glass untouched, her expression tight with disbelief. The confidence she had worn like jewelry earlier in the evening had cracked, and for the first time Clara saw uncertainty behind the polished exterior. The orchestra swelled, strings rising toward the center of the piece. Adrian turned Clara smoothly beneath the chandelier light, and a murmur ran through the crowd as her simple black dress caught the movement and flowed around her like dark silk. She realized with sudden clarity that no one was looking at the dress anymore. They were looking at the way Adrian looked at her, with respect, with attention, with a quiet pride he was no longer hiding. Why are you doing this? She asked softly when they came together again. Adrian's expression grew thoughtful. Because I should have done it sooner. Clara frowned slightly. Done what? Made it clear that the people who stand beside me deserve the same respect I expect for myself. The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. For years she had accepted being overlooked as part of the job. She had told herself that competence was enough, that recognition was unnecessary, that staying invisible was safer. Yet hearing him say those words felt like someone opening a door she had convinced herself did not exist. Near the front tables, one of the foreign investors leaned toward another and whispered something while nodding in Clara's direction. A hospital foundation board member smiled warmly at her as they passed. The change was subtle but undeniable. The room that had dismissed her an hour ago was beginning to see her through Adrian's eyes. Vanessa suddenly stepped forward from the crowd. Adrian, may I have a word? She asked, her tone carefully controlled. The music continued, but the guests closest to them went still. Adrian did not stop dancing. You may speak, he said evenly. Vanessa glanced at Clara before forcing a smile. I think this has gone far enough. People are going to get the wrong impression. Adrian's gaze hardened slightly. The wrong impression was that kindness could be mistaken for status, and that a woman could be publicly humiliated without consequences. Vanessa's composure faltered. I was joking. No, Adrian said calmly. You were measuring someone's worth by her appearance. The words landed like a quiet verdict. No one came to Vanessa's defense. Clara felt the entire ballroom listening. Adrian guided her through another turn before speaking again, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Miss Whitmore has worked beside me for 4 years. She has protected confidential negotiations, prevented costly mistakes, and earned my trust every single day. If any person in this room believes she is beneath their respect, they are misunderstanding who I choose to rely on." A hush followed, deeper than before. Clara's eyes stung unexpectedly, and she blinked quickly, refusing to let tears fall in the middle of the dance floor. Adrian noticed anyway. His voice softened as he looked at her. "Do not lower your head now, Clara." Slowly, almost cautiously, she lifted her chin. The ballroom was still watching, but the laughter was gone. In its place was something she had never expected to receive in a room like this: acknowledgement. And as Adrian led her into the final sweeping turn of the waltz, Clara realized that the hand holding hers was not pulling her into the spotlight for spectacle. It was pulling her out of the shadows for good. The final notes of the waltz faded into the ballroom like a slow exhale, but Adrian did not release Clara's hand. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The chandeliers glowed overhead, casting warm light across the polished floor, and the silence that followed felt more powerful than applause. Then, one by one, guests began to clap. The sound started hesitantly near the back of the room, then spread until the entire ballroom was filled with applause that echoed off marble and crystal. Clara stood beside Adrian, stunned. An hour earlier, those same people had been laughing at her dress, her hair, her place in the room. Now they were applauding while the most influential man in the ballroom kept her hand in his, as though he had no intention of letting go. Adrian looked toward the orchestra leader and gave a small nod of thanks before turning to the master of ceremonies. "Hold the next dance for a moment," he said. The master of ceremonies immediately stepped back from the microphone. Adrian guided Clara toward the center of the ballroom rather than returning her to the sidelines. She felt every eye following them, but the fear that had knotted in her chest earlier was beginning to loosen. Adrian faced the crowd, his expression composed, his voice carrying effortlessly through the room. "There is something I want to correct tonight," he said. The applause died away instantly. "Many of you know Clara Whitmore as my executive secretary. That title is accurate, but it is incomplete." He glanced at Clara briefly before continuing. "For years ago, she walked into my office with no connections, no influential last name, and no reason to believe she would be taken seriously. Since then, she has become one of the most capable professionals in my organization." Clara's breath caught. Adrian was not a man who gave public compliments lightly. She has coordinated negotiations involving projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She has caught legal and financial errors before they became disasters. Tonight alone, she prevented a seating mistake that could have created a political controversy for this foundation before the first course was served. A wave of surprised whispers moved through the crowd. Several executives exchanged startled looks, clearly realizing they had never known the extent of Clara's responsibilities. Adrian's gaze swept across the ballroom, calm and unwavering. While some people were busy evaluating her appearance, she was protecting the reputation of everyone in this room. Vanessa lowered her eyes. The women who had laughed with her suddenly seemed very interested in their champagne glasses. Adrian's voice grew quieter, but somehow even more commanding. "I built my business by learning to recognize value where others overlooked it. Clara Whitmore is not standing beside me tonight because I felt sorry for her. She is standing beside me because she has earned my trust, my respect, and my gratitude." Clara felt emotion rise so quickly she had to steady her breathing. No one had ever spoken about her that way in public. Not professors, not former employers, not even members of her own family who loved her but had always worried she worked too hard for too little recognition. Adrian turned fully toward her then, and for a moment the crowded ballroom seemed to disappear. "You have spent years making sure everyone else is prepared, protected, and supported," he said softly. "You should know what it feels like to have someone do the same for you." Clara's eyes filled despite her efforts to remain composed. She looked down briefly, then remembered his words from the dance floor and lifted her chin again. Adrian gave a faint, approving nod. Behind them, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks was smiling openly, pride shining in her eyes. One of the senior investors began clapping again, this time with genuine admiration rather than polite obligation. Others quickly joined in. The applause grew warmer, fuller, and this time it was directed at Clara, not because of the man standing beside her, but because they finally understood who she was. Adrian leaned slightly closer, his voice meant only for her. "I told you they were looking at the wrong thing." Clara let out a shaky breath that turned into a small, disbelieving smile. For the first time that evening, she believed him. The applause lingered long after Adrian finished speaking, and Clara stood in the center of the ballroom feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life. People who had barely acknowledged her existence earlier were now looking at her with a mixture of admiration and embarrassment. A few executives nodded respectfully as they passed. One of the hospital foundation directors even approached long enough to say, "Miss Whitmore, I had no idea how much you handled for the company. Thank you for protecting tonight's event." Clara managed a gracious smile, still trying to absorb the fact that she was being thanked instead of tolerated. Adrian remained beside her through it all, calm and unhurried, as though standing next to her in front of the entire ballroom required no explanation. Vanessa Sinclair disappeared quietly from the crowd, her earlier confidence replaced by the uncomfortable realization that cruelty had exposed far more about her character than it ever had about Clara's appearance. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks approached with unmistakable pride in her eyes. "I believe I owe you an apology," she said gently. Clara blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For telling you that Mr. Moretti notices more than people think," Mrs. Brooks replied with a warm smile. "I underestimated just how much he notices." Adrian allowed himself the faintest smile at that, and Clara felt another wave of disbelief. She had spent years seeing only the disciplined businessman, the man who spoke in precise sentences and carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Tonight she was seeing the person beneath that control, someone who had been paying attention in ways she had never imagined. The orchestra began a softer melody in the background as guests slowly returned to their conversations. Adrian finally turned to her. "Have you eaten anything tonight?" Clara let out a small laugh. "I have been a little busy." "That is what I thought." He offered his arm with quiet formality. "Come with me." She hesitated for only a second before resting her hand lightly on his arm. Together they walked away from the center of the ballroom, not toward the staff corridor where Clara would normally disappear, but toward a small private terrace overlooking the river. The cool night air greeted them again, carrying the distant sound of the city below. For the first time all evening they were alone. Clara rested her hands on the stone railing and looked out at the water. "I still cannot believe you did that." Adrian stood beside her, close enough to feel reassuring, not overwhelming. "Neither can I," he admitted. She turned to him, startled by the honesty. "You never do anything without thinking it through." "I did think it through," he said. "I spent 20 minutes watching you be treated unfairly, and I realized I was more concerned about protecting business relationships than protecting someone who has been standing beside me for 4 years. I did not like what that said about me." Clara studied him quietly. The vulnerability in his voice was subtle, but real. "You protected me when it mattered," she said. "You should not have needed protecting in the first place." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment neither spoke. Then Adrian reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Clara's eyes widened. "What is that?" "A thank you," he said. He opened the box, revealing a delicate silver bracelet, elegant and understated, nothing like the extravagant diamonds displayed in the ballroom. "This belonged to my grandmother. She used to say that the strongest people are usually the ones no one notices until the moment everything falls apart." Clara looked at the bracelet, then at him. "I cannot accept something so personal." "Yes, you can," Adrian said softly, "because tonight was not about a bracelet or a dance. It was about making sure you never again have to wonder whether you belong in the room." Carefully, he took the bracelet from the box and fastened it around her wrist. His fingers brushed her skin briefly, respectful and gentle. Clara looked down at the silver catching the moonlight, and emotion rose in her throat so suddenly she could not speak. Adrian closed the empty box and met her eyes. You once told me your father taught you that character is what you have when nobody is watching, he said. Tonight an entire ballroom was watching, and your character never changed. Clara felt tears gather again, but this time she did not hide them. She smiled through them instead. Behind them, the ballroom lights glowed through the tall glass doors, distant now, almost unimportant. Adrian remained beside her, and for the first time in 4 years, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future where she was not merely the woman standing quietly behind the most powerful man in the room. And that night, surrounded by diamonds, chandeliers, and people who had judged her in a single glance, the ballroom learned what dignity truly looked like.